For centuries, this morning's story has intrigued its audience. For some folks, it's a story of multiplication. As dinner time rolled around, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes were given to Jesus, who offered up thanks for them before distributing to the crowd of more than 5,000 people. And miraculously, the food seemed to multiply even as the baskets of food were being passed from one person to another, so that no one went away hungry on that day. When others read the story, they see it not as so much a miracle of multiplication, but one of addition. They see that it would have been they feel that it would have been highly unlikely that only one person among 5,000 would have thought to bring food. And as the 5 loaves and 2 fish of this young boy were being distributed, the folks who had previously said they had nothing to give were struck by their own guilty consciences and added their own food to what was being passed around. And like anyone who has ever attended a potluck knows, there was more than enough food to feed everyone. Both explanations are valid. But since the author of the gospel doesn't provide insight as to how the miracle took place, we can only assume that that's not the point of the story. We're not meant to understand the how behind the story, but rather the why behind it. And just as there is more than one valid explanation for this morning's story, there is also more than one valid reason for telling it. For some folks, this story offers evidence of Jesus as the one sent from God. No one but God's only begotten could perform such miraculous deeds as raising the dead, healing the sick, walking on water, and in this case, feeding a crowd of more than 5,000 people with nothing more than a few loaves of bread and a couple fish. This is just one more piece of evidence of Jesus' divine power. For others, this story is a story about discipleship. In the Synoptic Gospels, after Jesus blesses the food, he gives it to the disciples to distribute to the crowd. The story then is an instruction for those who commit to following Jesus. And one of the ways we can do that is by feeding the hungry. Some see this as a story about placing your trust and faith in a God who provides for our needs. You may be down to nothing but the bare essentials, but if you trust God, your needs will not only be met, but you will be blessed with more than enough to satisfy you. Still others see this as a story about stewardship. What we have may not seem like much, but when we place it in God's hands, God can use it for the greater good of the world. There are many different reasons for sharing this story, each of them as valid as the next. But this morning I want to share with you yet another reason for the story. I believe the story as it's told in the Gospel of John is a story that points to God's presence in the world. It's not unusual for people to look for God in the midst of a personal crisis or natural disaster. In fact, it seems to be human nature. When someone dies from a terminal illness, the family cries out to the heavens in their grief, asking where God was when their loved one suffered. When a family suddenly finds itself homeless because its house burned to the ground, they struggle to make sense of what has happened by trying to understand how a loving God could allow such a tragedy to happen. The same goes for the LGBT person who is bullied and harassed at school or in the workplace. The person of color who is the victim of white privilege and entitlement. The woman who has been sexually assaulted. The refugee seeking asylum who has had their children torn from their arms. Where is God in this mess? If God is all loving and God is all powerful, then why is there suffering? And where is God in the midst of the suffering? Within the context of this morning's story, then, we ask, where is God in the midst of 5,000 hungry people? People who lived hand to mouth every day of their lives. People who were looking for a king to follow, someone who would lead them in a revolt against the Roman Empire. People who clung to hope because that's all they had left. So where was God in the midst of all that suffering? God's presence and God's grace was in the feeding. God's grace is always in the meeting of the needs of others. God showed up in the rescue of 12 members of the Wild Boar soccer team and their coach after being trapped for more than 2 weeks inside a cave in Thailand. God was present as the world held its breath, hoping against hope for their safety. God was in a meeting I attended a week and a half ago where representatives from different local religions gathered to begin exploring ways to support families who are being negatively affected by U.S. immigration policies. And God shows up every time our church puts some groceries in the hands of HIV-positive people who need help putting food on the table. Whether it's a 21st century guest of our church's food and hygiene pantry, or it's 5,000 first century peasants sitting on a hill, God always shows up in the feeding of people. 4 years ago, Ferguson, Missouri made headlines because of the riots that swept through the town following the fatal shooting of Michael Brown by a white police officer on August 9, 2014. Among the protesters was a woman named Kathy Daniels, Mama Cat to her friends. Mama Cat marched and chanted, but perhaps just as importantly, she fed the black men and women who took to the streets of Ferguson. Nearly every Sunday after 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot and killed, Mama Cat served hot homemade meals to protesters on South Florissant Road, where the most heated moments of the protests took place. Some 4 years later, what had started as an immediate reaction to the protests, a way to support and nourish the activists and demonstrators who filled the streets of Ferguson, has flourished into a project now fueled by donations and grants that for Mama Cat goes even deeper in its efforts to heal and help the community. Now Mama Cat and her band of volunteers known as Pot Bangers have expanded their efforts to feeding the homeless of St. Louis. But each exchange isn't just about handing out a meal. She hugs and kisses each recipient, and they chat and laugh about the latest goings-on in their lives. For Mama Cat, food is a way of people connecting with each other, and so feeding people is her way of doing that. My guess is that Jesus felt the same way. Jesus saw people who were hungry, and he knew what he had to do. He invited them to sit down, and he fed them. God is present every time people are fed. Every time one human being touches the life of another human being. Every time you and I take the risk of caring about somebody else. This morning's story was an important story for the early Christian church, and for many reasons it still is. And one of the reasons it's important is because it gives us a clue of where to look for God. Fred Rogers, host of the long-running show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, is quoted as saying, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.' And I will add, where you find people helping, you will always find God." Where do we find God? And what does God's grace look like? It looks like people helping other people. Sometimes it's just that simple. Amen.